Amen. I feel a little awkward talking about humility this morning. It's a little hard to feel humble when you're standing at the front of a room expecting people to listen to something that you have to say as if it were, I don't know, important. There are a lot of stories. I think, where Jesus endeavors to show us what it means to be humble, what humility is really all about. And despite, in the translation, the presence of the word humble in the story, I'm not really sure that that's actually just what the story's about. I think there's a little bit more to it. And so, very first thing I want to show you is, I want to show you a short clip, like less than a minute, I think. It's from a 2004 movie, King Arthur, with Clive Owen. Aside from me and Damien, I'm sure no one else has seen it. But you should. It's really awesome. Anyway, it's about King Arthur, right? So the movie is based on the historical precedent that there might have been an actual character that King Arthur was the character in the legend is based on. And there is historical evidence to suggest that that character might have been somebody towards the end of when the Romans were leaving Britain, and it was somebody who was part Roman and part Britain, and that person led a group of people who were knights, but they weren't Romans. They were Sarmatians. You might have heard this theory. They were from Eastern Europe, and they were conscripted by the Romans to go and fight elsewhere. See the movie. But there's a moment right near the beginning where a guy comes from Rome, a Bishop Germanus, who is not only a bishop, he's a former general. And he comes to see them because he's going to release them. The Romans are leaving Britain, and he's going to release them from their conscription in the Roman army, as long as they do one more thing, which is the premise of the rest of the movie. But there's this moment when Bishop Germanus comes to meet them, which is very revealing, let's say. Damien.
Sir, I'm here to escort you to the Fortress Hall.
When my master meets with your knights, he must be seated last, and he must be seated at the head of the table.
Your master can plonk his holy arse wherever he chooses.
His Eminence, Bishop Gnaeus Germanus.
A round table. What sort of evil is this?
Arthur says for men to be men, they must first all be equal.
I was given to understand there would be more of you.
There were. We have been fighting here for 15 years, Bishop.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen the movie, you should see the movie. Really, it really is good. But here's the thing. There's a bunch of stuff to notice there. Not the least of which is, Arthur's servant refers to him as Arthur. The bishop's servant refers to him as my master. You saw the expression on his face when he saw the round table, and that it's evil. And, okay, the sexist language of, the 3rd century notwithstanding, in order for people to be people, they must be equal. That's the point of the round table. We all know that from the legend, right? Arthur has a round table so that all the knights will be equal. No, actually, he has a round table so they'll all be equal, not just the knights, him too. Right? And in fact, if you watch this movie, all the way through the movie, all of the other knights refer to him as Arthur. Right? So, right away, Arthur has established the equality of everyone simply by seating him at a table that is round. The bishop expects to be seated in the place of honor, the head of the table. Because, why? Well, because he's a bishop. Bishops are important, aren't they? Okay, we don't have those, but other Christian traditions have bishops, and yes, they are. They're important because they're a significant piece of the hierarchy. The word hierarchy, by the way, literally means sacred order. It comes from Greek and Latin words that mean sacred order. And one of the interesting things about hierarchy is hierarchy tends to work however you want it to work in order to emphasize that you're important. I can remember as a choir boy in an English cathedral kind of tradition, and I always remember whenever there was a big important service, who went in first? The boys in the choir, followed by the men of the choir, followed by the lowest of the clergy, followed by archdeacons and canons, the dean, various other people, important dignitaries, but the bishop came last. Why? Because the last shall be first. We have a problem here. And the problem isn't about being humble. The problem is how we might use information in order to create structure and hierarchy that makes us important. You can see that right away in this story, because as you listen to the beginning of this story and you see Jesus sees them all trying to decide where they're going to sit, you know it's not like a dinner party that you go to. You know that awkward moment at the beginning of a dinner party where there's a bunch of people there, there's a group there, and there's one table, or worse, there's two tables and one is slightly lower and has slightly worse chairs. But you go, and you all stand around going, where are we all going to sit now? I don't know. Where shall we all sit? Until whoever's in charge tells you where. There's always somebody, though, who goes, no, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to sit here. Hey, you, come and sit here with me, right? There's always somebody who does that. There might also always be somebody who's going to sit at the far end of the little lower, lesser table with like crappy chairs at it. Somebody's going to sit there, too. And everyone else is going to stand around going, where do we sit? But let me ask you this. If you've had that awkward moment, are you doing that because you don't want to be the first person to sit down and you want the host to tell you where to sit? Or are you just trying to figure out who's the most important person in the room? Right? That's maybe why we don't have such a great handle on this story, is because in Jesus' day, there was a hierarchy and you sat according to who was the most important person in the, I can't even say the words, important person in the room. And here he is at the house of a Pharisee. Who do you think is the most important person in the room? The host, in this instance, is probably the most important person in the room, which is, that's a quandary, because hospitality, right? Hospitality rules, right? You want to be hospitable to people, and you want people to know that they sit where they should sit. And the thing is, you might then start to wonder, well, okay, but Jesus is the guest. In fact, he's likely the guest of honor. Wouldn't he sit next to the host? Why is everyone kind of jockeying for their spot? Well, could be because, a variety of reasons, but it could be because they don't all know each other, so they don't exactly know who's who. It could be that even though they know each other and they pretty much have an idea of what their place is in society, they're just trying to figure out who's above and below them in the place in society. That's the problem with the story, is that everyone comes to the table knowing they have a certain place and that there are going to be people in the room who are above them and are below them. It's not just a question, the story isn't just a question of personal humility. It's a question of society structures that say some people are more important than others. And more specifically, some people are more important than others, not even on the basis of what kind of person they are or what they do, but because of what their title is. The bishop expected to be seated at the head of the table because whoever else was in the room, he knew he was the most important person. Didn't matter who else was in the room. He's a bishop. in this story with Jesus trying to figure out who gets to sit where, it's all about that. It's about hierarchy. It's about who gets to sit where. And there's a problem with that because we can use hierarchy. We can use the system to either be more or less important. So, for example, if I'm a bishop, I'm going to come last because the last shall be first. That's not the point of saying that. In fact, surely, if you intentionally make yourself last, because that will make you first, you've just manipulated the system, haven't you? You just made it work for you. Where's the humility in that? We have structure, and in Jesus' day, there was a lot of structure. People knew their place. And who very definitely was at the very bottom of that structure? Well, the very people that Jesus then goes on to say, these are the people you should invite. Don't invite the people you know can invite you back, or bring a nice bottle of wine, or, Kraken. Depends on what you drink. You're on your own. But the point is, it's those very people who will feel that they are the marginalized, the bottom of the structure. Those are the people we should be connecting with. Why? Because we should be sitting at a round table. I'm going to just go out on a limb with this one and hope nobody throws anything at me. We shouldn't even be sitting like this. We should be sitting around a table, right? In the earliest days, the followers of Jesus gathered in houses, right? And so they would gather around a table because a key part of the story is that story of Jesus breaking bread and sharing the cup. The body and blood of Jesus story, right? The Last Supper. So we gather around a table. As we moved into buildings, there were no chairs. And guess where the table was? It was in the middle of the floor, so we could all gather around it. But then we started to move into these buildings that usually it was taking over like what it was essentially Roman community halls, basilicas. And then there's a little apse, a little curved bit at one end, so that's where the table went. And suddenly we were all facing it. And suddenly we had us and them, bishops and clergy, and then you people, and you'd all sit out there. But you didn't have chairs yet, of course. And then we actually started to build the sanctuary piece of the church. And it had this thing called a rood screen. That's R-O-O-D, it's not R-U-D-E, although I find it rude. But it was essentially a screen that separated this piece from here. Because why? Because here in the nave, the body, right? You are the body. That's the important part. You riffraff sit out here. We created that. And then we had seats specifically. We initially had seats on the walls specifically for people who needed to sit. And that was, to be fair, initially that was people who had disabilities or there was some reason why they needed to sit. But where were they? Way off at the sides. Then we started to put in pews. And if you've ever been to particularly high Anglican services, there's a person who leads everybody in the procession, and they're called a verger. And they have a little stick, or it might be a wand of some kind, or in some cases a staff. When they started doing that, it was a club. Not making this up. Wrote a paper on it in seminary. It was a club. And why? To get the people out of the way so the procession could pass through to the front. Because there was no organization. You people went wherever you wanted. You people. Then we put in pews. Seats, benches. We put in benches so that y'all could sit down and we could organize you better. And then we had pews that had doors, and you bought them. So rich people could sit at the front, or they'd have a box seat, literally a box seat at the side, and they paid for that. And you riffraff sat at the back. Still, you couldn't see what was going on at the front, really, until I showed you That's where all this comes from. I think we're trying hard to get back, we're trying to get away from that. We're trying to get back to the whole idea of the table in the middle and everyone gathers around. Draw the circle wide. You know that song? We sing it all the time. Because we want people to gather around, because that creates a level of equality. We all belong in the circle. I have a feeling I'm still going to stand in the center of it, but still, that's not who's supposed to be in the center of it. God's supposed to be at the center of it, in which case we're all part of the circle. Doesn't matter where you sit, because we're all equal. Here's Jesus addressing a society which has a very specific structure. And they are occupied by a society that has a very specific structure. And that very specific structure is geared to the hierarchy of this person at the top being important and this person at the bottom not being. In fact, I don't even care who that is because they're not important. We are all equal in the eyes of God. We are all one body. In fact, you'll hear many, the moment I even say the words, we are one body, I bet for many people the first thing that jumps into your head is the part of one of Paul's letters where he talks about we're all parts of the body and we're all necessary parts of the body. And not only are we all connected because we are one body, we are all equally connected. Every part of the body is equal and equally important. It's not just a question of personal humility. It's a question of understanding the justice of an equitable society. In fact, I have to stop saying equal because we're not. Equal implies that we're all starting from the same place. That's why things can be equal. But we don't all start from the same place. We don't have equity. There are people who aren't able to afford the things that these people are able to afford, so you can't say they're equal. We need to have some equity. We need to have a level playing field. Here's Jesus trying to create that. Here's Jesus trying to remind people that we have a built-in structure that encourages us to think about our own level of self-importance and our place in that structure. We still do. We still do. Look at me standing at the front. So are you listening to me because you think, hey, this is something that might be worth listening to? Or are you listening to me because I'm the minister? I have a title. I have a place. It's tricky, isn't it? Because not everyone is going to say one or the other. And sometimes it's both, let's be fair. I have a platform. How am I using it? Jesus had a platform. How's he using it here? And that's a really interesting part about this story. By the way, the passage of scripture we heard this morning, you might have heard me say verse 1 and then verses 7 to, I left out a chunk. What I left out was a healing story that happens at the beginning of the. But here's the key part, the reason why, and it's not necessarily connected to these other pieces, but the reason why we need to hear that first verse, though, was Jesus goes for supper. First of all, he goes for supper at a Pharisee's house. And secondly, they were watching him closely. So he's accepted the invitation. In fact, a Pharisee has invited him. So what does that mean? Maybe we're not yet at the point where they all hate him, not that they all did, but maybe this is a Pharisee who maybe this is one of the religious leaders who wants to hear what Jesus has to say. But they were watching him closely. And it was the Sabbath. And then this is why we left out that chunk, is that he heals somebody on the Sabbath. What did we talk about last week? Well, he heals somebody on the Sabbath. So we jump to the story about people getting to sit down for dinner. But he's at the Pharisee's house. He's at an important person's house, and they're watching him closely. And so, I'm sorry, I get to say this pun again. He turns the tables on them and instead watches them closely and points out what they're doing. So next time you're at a dinner party and there's a large crowd of people and they're all milling around trying to decide where to sit and they're feeling kind of awkward, be sure to very loudly say, "Well, I guess you're all trying to decide who's most important so you know where to sit." Because he effectively does that. He calls out that whole structure thing. Because he's looking for equity. And so he goes on to talk about, listen, if you're gonna have a dinner party, invite the people who aren't then gonna owe you something and be able to repay it. Do that simply because we're all worthy of that. We all have a place at the table. And every place is a place of honor. We all have a place at a table that ought to be a table of equity, a table of everyone being and feeling like not only feeling like they've been invited, but that they belong at that table. Right? It's a difference between welcome and belonging. Inclusion means that you not only participate, but then you feel like what you bring, what you offer, your uniqueness becomes part of that whole dynamic. You've affected the whole group. That's when we start to become one body. And you can't do that if you make people sit in a certain place. So at the end of the service today, you're all going to help me move these pews so that we can make we went to. They're too heavy and they're straight and they're long, right? You can't make a circle with these. We have tried. But where we're going needs to be to that round table to which everyone is welcome, to which everyone feels like wherever they're seated at that table, that is a place of honor, just like all of the other seats. At the table, everyone is equal.